Please welcome Jeanette Wing.
Hello, everyone. I'm back. So thank you, Peter, for that very nice talk about where computer science is going and where it's been. This is the Hot Topics session, and we're going to hear from 4 different research projects, and that basically span the interest and breadth of research at Microsoft Research, from AI and machine learning to privacy and security to systems and networking to healthcare and biology. And what I'm going to do is let you hear from the researchers themselves. So I'm going to call up 1 or 2 persons per project, and we'll have a little informal Q&A, and we'll hear from them about the research. So I'd like to start with AI. Of course, you've heard, and everyone knows it's in the air, that with the advances in deep learning and reinforcement learning and so on, we've really made tremendous progress in tasks like speech and object recognition and so on. And I think this has emboldened the entire community, the research community and industry, to strive again for that grand quest in AI, to build an agent that combines all the cognitive skills of humans: vision, speech, natural language understanding, even mobility. So in our first story, we're going to hear about the combination of vision and natural language understanding. And let me start with a teaser. Whoops. Let's see. There we go. Look at this picture. What is the first question that comes to your mind when you see this picture?
What happened to the rider?
What's happened? Was anyone hurt? Was the motorcyclist injured? Now imagine trying to get a computer to generate those questions. There isn't even a motorcyclist in the picture for the computer to talk about. So this is not so easy. So what I'd like to do is call up Lucy Vanderwende to join me on stage, and we'll talk about this visual question generation task. Lucy?
Hi, Jeanette. Thank you.
Good. Thanks. Have a seat.
Yes.
So can you explain why would we want to get computers to generate questions in the first place? What's the context and motivation for this work?
Well, questions are very interesting. And in fact, questions are one way that we as people demonstrate an understanding of the situation. So we don't walk around making statements all day long. That would be very robotic. We sometimes give information, but we also ask information. We ask questions. And so to be natural, we want to train a computer to do both as well, ask questions and answer questions. Now, why photos? Photos are interesting because imagine how many conversations get started when you show a picture to a friend. Imagine how popular Snapchat and Instagram are, in fact. And sometimes the conversation just says, oh, how cute, or oh, that's terrible, and the conversation ends. But sometimes you might get somebody might ask you a question, and you really take that opportunity to engage with that person and to really get to know them better. And that's the kind of natural question that we're after.
Great. So, as a human, I don't think, how is it that I generate questions? It just comes naturally. We just generate questions or ask questions naturally. So how is it that you think about how to get a machine to generate questions?
Well, how we say what we're going to say as humans is kind of still a deeply philosophical question, and we really don't know the answer yet. But for computers, we can think of a few models. So one is to think of each conversational turn as a translation from what I hear to what I'm going to say. And in fact, it's my colleagues Bill Dolan and Michel Gali who have pioneered this machine translation model for conversation. There's another model which treats conversation like retrieval. What is the biggest chunk of something that I've said before or heard before that best matches the input, and just output that without thinking?
It's like a lookup table.
It's a lookup table. the thing that we're, of course, interested in is the neural models, where given an input, what should the system pay attention to, and which words are triggered by that input? And we think that this best explains the questions that we see for motorcycles. The motorcycle picture, where the system observes the collection of objects, those together evoke accident, hurt, injured, and then from that we generate a question.
Well, I understand in all three of these generative models, they fell short of human ability. So how far did they fall short, and what can we as a community do to make progress on this task?
So a human evaluation tells us that a human-generated question scores 2.5 on average for a scale of 1 to 3 for naturalness. Our best model, the neural model, scores on average 1.75. So there's a gap. And the gap is largely explained by the variety of questions that the computer can ask. And there are two ways that we want to work on this. One is through better content selection. So for this image, for sure you can say, who is this? But surely there is something much more compelling and interesting to ask about.
Is that really a donut?
It is really a donut. So that's the thing. It's as people, we zoom in on what's important. Whereas the machine right now, the computer is still in the stage of cataloging what are the objects in its field of vision. Mm-hmm. So question generation is actually a really nice way to test whether a computer can pay attention to the right things.
It can focus in on the interest.
Right. And another way to increase the variety of questions will be better common sense reasoning. So for the motorcycle accident picture, in our data set, we have enough images of accident that it knows to recognize an accident and then to say, did somebody get hurt? But for an image like this, we don't yet have enough samples in our data set. So how does it go from seeing that there's a potato to knowing that we could ask a question, what's for dinner? That would seem to require common sense. As people, we think that this is common sense. But common sense may itself not come as a component, a standalone component that the machine needs, right? How to learn this common sense and how to represent it are themselves interesting research questions.
I actually understand, even for your PhD thesis, you were struggling with this term vegetable market.
Right. Yes. So. Noun compounds, they're fascinating.
So, what do you see as the challenges for our being able to use this kind of question-answer kind of system to build truly conversational agents that we can talk about our daily lives with in a very informal manner?
Right. So I think right now, we can use conversational agents at the level of an acquaintance. We've told them some information. We're willing to share some information, and locally it might be coherent. I think the challenge is sustained conversation over time. So the difference between an acquaintance and a friend is a friend remembers the information that we've told it and uses that information in really subtle ways to demonstrate the bond that we have. So imagine that you've posted this picture and
that's not really my car.
Not really. But a brand new conversational agent might say, whose car is this? And you would let's pretend you're going to say,
okay. It's my car.
It's your car.
Everyone knows here I drive a Miata, a red one.
I had to take a stock picture. But then next week, you post this picture of the car, but now on a highway scene. Now, should the computer now say whose car is that? No. Right. It would break your trust because you know this has already been asked before.
It didn't remember that.
It didn't remember, right? So there are other questions that are more natural given our past history. So I think those are one of the challenges. But another thing I wanted to bring out about conversational agents is this one. A great example where we've just finished training a model that, given the image and given some limited amount of context, here I made a little treat for my coworkers, the machine now can generate a new question. And I was really surprised when it generated where's mine?
Wow.
Right? That made me laugh. But then it also realized, you know, we need to add some fun to our conversational agents as well. So in order to have that sustained conversation, it's not only about the information, it's also about the experience and the engagement.
Yes, thank you very much, Lucy. So
and
that's great.
Just wanted to say on the topic of fun, I enjoy working with all of my collaborators, and I just wanted to call out especially Nasser and Mostafazadeh, who's been the main person who's been working on this project for the last year.
And she's here in the audience, I believe.
She's here in the audience.
So,
Thank
great.
you.
Thank you very much, Lucy.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Jeanette.
So the next story is about the marriage between cryptography and machine learning. And so let me start with the cryptography side of the story. In 2009, Craig Gentry published his breakthrough result on fully homomorphic encryption, showing how we can actually compute over encrypted data. And this gave, especially the privacy advocates, a hope that we could actually entrust in cloud providers private data and have the cloud compute over the encrypted data without seeing the data in plain text. And so in this particular work, we're going to show how we are able to use homomorphic encryption to build prediction services. And the work builds on a simple encrypted arithmetic library called SEAL that we implemented here at Microsoft Research and released to the public last November for download. So this is one of the building blocks that we're providing all of you to work with and that we use ourselves. I'd like to call Ronnie Gilad-Bachrach up on stage, and we will talk more about this marriage between cryptography and machine learning. Ronnie?
Hi, Jeanette.
Nice seeing you. Here you go. So before we get into the technical details, Ronnie, give us one example of motivating this work.
Yeah, so imagine you had your DNA sequence. So obviously, you may want to use it to get some predictions or risk factors you might have. But if there was a service providing these predictions, you might be reluctant to use it because they might leak your information, whether intentionally or unintentionally. And once your DNA leaked, it's much harder to get the new one compared to just getting a new credit card. So the question we were asking is, can we build such a service that can make these predictions, but without leaking your information?
That's great. So you are a machine learning expert. Not a cryptography expert, let alone homomorphic encryption expert. And you work with cryptographers who are not machine learning experts, let alone deep neural network experts. So what was the aha that you had to make this marriage work?
Yeah. So, you know, when I was introduced to this concept of homomorphic encryptions, I was looking for the catch, because morally it should be impossible to compute over encrypted data. But you know, after I looked at the math, and you know, I came to realize, yes, it's possible, but I'm not at the level that I can really modify it or tweak it. I can understand it. And the aha moment was when I was talking to my cryptographer partners and realized that they see machine learning in the same way. They see it as black magic that works, they can understand it, they can use it, but they cannot modify it in order to solve a problem. And once we work together, we can actually open all these black boxes. And let me give you an example for that. So, for example, one of the keys in neural networks is activation function. Activation function is just a nonlinear function. Typically, we use a sigmoid function or the rectified linear function. And the problem is when you want to apply it to data that is encrypted with homomorphic encryption, it's kind of hard. People tried it and without great success. But when I look at it as a machine learning researcher, I know that there is nothing sacred about these specific functions, right? We use them out of convenience. They are very convenient for use, but we can use many others. So now we were talking and trying to understand what are the real limitations that we have. From cryptography, the main limitation, in order to be practical, is that the function that you want to apply have to be a polynomial of low degree. From a machine learning point of view, the main limitation is that it has to be nonlinear. So now you put all these limitations together. You're looking for a nonlinear function which is polynomial of low degree. It's x squared.
That was Yaha.
Yeah. And so here's an example of how we tweaked the machine learning part of it to make things more practical. But the same thing happened when we tweaked the cryptography part of it. For example, same thing when you apply neural network, you have a lot of time that you want to multiply your data by some constants. It turns out that you can do this multiplication much faster when you multiply a constant by a data than multiplying 2 data points. This is something that I, as a machine learning researcher, would not have come up with, but for the cryptographer, this is kind of, oh yeah, you can do that. And once you sit together, you just see everything opens up.
Well, that's wonderful. When Ronnie first told me about this work, he told this story in the AHA, and I was so excited. I was so impressed. And this really goes to show how people in different disciplines coming together can really make new things happen. One of the things that I hear a lot is when you mention cryptography, especially to systems people, they think, oh, slow. It's going to slow my system down. Doesn't speed up. It's performance is bad. So, but you actually, with this work, have very good performance. And you can show that this work actually applies to a range of applications. Can you speak to that?
Yeah. So, homomorphic encryption is treated in many cases as a nice theoretical exercise of no practical use. And we wanted to try whether we can make it practical. So the first thing that we tried is neural network. We already talked about it. And here we used a standard benchmark in machine learning, which is the MNIST data set. You have handwritten digit, and you're trying to recognize the digits. We built a neural network that had an accuracy of 99%. It's not the state of the art, but it's a very decent result for this data set. And we're able to make a prediction on a single image in 5 minutes on a single desktop. And then our cryptographer pulled another trick, which allows actually to batch the predictions. So you can make 4,000 predictions in 5 minutes. And just to give you a sense of the security that we have, actually the service that provides the prediction cannot tell the difference between whether it's making a single prediction or 4,000 predictions. We even didn't have to change a line of code in order to allow that. So here we can do it in 5 minutes, but then we went on and we did a little hackathon in our offices in New England, and we built 2 additional applications. One of them is a pneumonia risk predictor. So here you're getting your medical record, and you're trying to compute the risk from pneumonia. And this is using a special kind of machine learning model, which is called interpretable models. And here, every prediction takes about 40 seconds. And again, you can stack them together and get 4,000 predictions in these 40 seconds. And another application that we built was a genomic predictor, which takes your DNA, so 200,000 SNPs, 200,000 variants of your DNA, and makes a prediction on your traits or risks. And this one takes 2 seconds to complete. Wow,
that's impressive.
And when you ask about whether it's practical or not, the way I like to think about it, are you willing to wait for 2 seconds when you're trying to get a prediction on your DNA and your risk and traits in order to make sure that it's secure? If you're willing to wait for 2 seconds, I think that homomorphic encryptions are practical and can be used for medical applications, but other applications as well, such as finance, for example, cases in which you care about your privacy.
I'm willing to wait 2 seconds. Thank you, Ronnie. That was beautiful. Thanks very much. And I did want to call out Ronnie's collaborators. And also, this is the URL that tells you where you can download the simple encrypted arithmetic library that I mentioned earlier. So in our next story, we're going to talk about security. Security is part of the bigger picture that I mentioned in my opening remarks about trust. In this case, trusting the internet. We trust the internet today to do all our daily transactions, our financial transactions, and so on. But we as computer scientists know quite well that the internet is insecure and quite vulnerable to attack. So in the Everest expedition that just started a couple months ago, the team's goal is to, within 4 years, deploy a verified, secure version of the entire HTTPS ecosystem. That's pretty ambitious. So the team we got together, or they formed themselves actually, is quite impressive also in that it spans 3 different labs in Bangalore, Cambridge, England, of course here in Redmond, and we have academic partners in INRIA and other universities. Now Cedric Fournay is a key person in this team, but he couldn't be here today. But we have Bryan, Parno, and Nikhil Swamy to join us to talk about the Everest expedition. So, Nick, Bryan, thanks for joining us. So Bryan, I'll start with you.
Sure.
What is HTTPS, and why is it so important? And can you give us some examples of some internet meltdowns because HTTPS is so insecure?
Sure. So HTTPS is critical infrastructure. It's the foundation on which internet security is built. So it includes not just the HTTPS protocol itself, but also the underlying transport layer security, or TLS protocol, the X509 standard for certificates and identity management, as well as numerous cryptographic algorithms. And it's used for internet traffic every single day. Over half the internet traffic is encrypted using HTTPS. And it's used not just for the web, but also for things like email, voice over IP, VPNs, and many other applications.
So we use it without even our realizing it.
Yes. And so unfortunately, that means because it's so ubiquitous, if there's a vulnerability in any of these components, then the entire world is at risk. And we've seen that with high-profile events like Heartbleed or the recent Freak attacks.
So what is Everest going to do about this?
Well, so we're going to be looking at all these different vulnerabilities that we've seen historically. So there's been, say, 20 years of attacks on this ecosystem, and they've ranged all the way from low-level buffer overflows to higher-level things like lax certificate parsing or validation, or weak or incorrect cryptography, to side channels, and even to design flaws in the standards themselves. And there's actually been multiple academic survey papers published just cataloging all the different ways in which this ecosystem has been broken. And many of these vulnerabilities are very subtle. They're not the kind of thing you're ever going to find through simple bounds checking or through randomized testing. And so to get rid of all these bugs that we've seen all over the ecosystem, and to avoid ever having another Heartbleed or a Freak attack, we're actually going to develop verified replacements for each one of these components. And we're going to prove that each component, as well as their composition, is secure. That means that we'll never have any of the vulnerabilities that I showed you on the previous slide. And furthermore, we're going to be focusing on deployability as well. We want our code to be high performance, standards compliant, and easy to interoperate with existing clients and servers. And of course, along the way, we'll be improving the tools that we're using to do this verification so that others can use them in future efforts.
Good. Nick, what exactly are we going to prove about our code, and what tools are we going to use to do those proofs?
Right. So clearly we want to prove that our code doesn't have any of the vulnerabilities that Bryan mentioned. But trying to go about this by enumerating all those vulnerabilities and trying to squash each one of them individually is a lost cause. First, because there's too many, right? And there's some that we may just not even anticipate. Right. So instead, what we're doing is identifying a simple, high-level security property that we can prove about our code, from which you can conclude that we're invulnerable to all these attacks that we know of, and other classes that we may not even know of yet. So to give you an example, for TLS, the protocol at the core of this ecosystem, what we prove is that an attacker cannot tell the difference between the concrete version of TLS that's actually encrypting secrets on the network and an idealized version of TLS that's only exchanging random bytes, except for a negligible probability subject to some cryptographic assumptions. So this is the kind of property that a cryptographer would prove about a protocol, usually about an idealized model of a protocol on pencil and paper. But what we're doing is we're proving this kind of property about the code that actually implements the protocol with all its optimizations down to the actual implementations of the crypto primitives. So to actually do these proofs...
It sounds like that's like a bisimulation argument.
That's right. It's a bisimulation, a kind of a probabilistic equivalence between these two versions of, of TLS. so we need to actually analyze the code to do these proofs. And for that, we make use of several verification tools that have been built at MSR. One of them, sort of near and dear to my heart, is
You can unzip your jacket and show off your T-shirt.
FSTAR is a programming language and a verification system that, on the one hand, looks a bit like a proof assistant like Coq, and on the other, it's based on a higher order, effectful, typed programming language, like in the tradition of standard ML. We use FSTAR to do the proofs of TLS. Another language that we use is Daphne, which looks a bit like C#. It's an imperative object-oriented language, but with a verification system that's based on first-order logic, first-order Hoare logic. Underlying both these tools is Z3, an automated theorem prover that's very widely used both inside MSR in many verification projects and outside MSR. I'm sure many of you out here have used Z3 for your projects. And without Z3, trying to scale our proofs to the extent to which we do scale them would just be unthinkable, I think. Now, lest I give the impression that we're just going to be completely bulletproof, what we're aiming to do, as Bryan mentioned, is to deploy verified code inside the existing software ecosystem. So we're going to have a deployment of Everest TLS inside, say, Apache. But we don't plan to verify the rest of Apache or the operating system on which it runs. And so it is possible that a vulnerability in the operating system could just take down the security of the entire stack, and having a verified TLS in there is a moot point. But we still think that being able to produce high assurance components that have provable security guarantees is really the only way in which you can build reliable stacks, and so we think what we do will have value.
I think it is a 4-year goal, and it is very ambitious to actually think about doing a verified system with lots and lots of complicated components that interact with each other, and then to do it in a performant way that you're just going to drop in. What makes you think you can succeed?
So yeah, it's certainly an ambitious set of goals, and we're helped by the fact that in general the field of software verification has advanced tremendously in the last 10 years. And in particular, our team is bringing together several lines of research that have been working in this general area, and so we're benefiting from previous results and experience. So for example, the MSR Ironclad project has been building a wide variety of high-performance system software that's been verified for both security and for reliability, say in the distributed setting. And we're able to get good performance in part because we're using verification languages that operate at a low imperative level, all the way down to the level of verified assembly code. Now, at a higher level, the MeTLS project has shown that it's possible to verify the security of real-world protocols. So not just models, but the actual protocols that are being used in the real world. And so they've shown that the process of verification actually leads to a better understanding of the security of the system itself, and discovers vulnerabilities at both the implementation and even the specification level. And these are vulnerabilities that have been lying there for years that nobody found. And of course, we're building on all of these verification tools that Nick mentioned, and so there's been tremendous progress there, and we're benefiting from that effort. And yet, if we look back at the ecosystem that we're trying to verify, you can see that the amount of work we've done so far really leaves a lot left to be done. And yet, as Nick alluded to, I think the HTTPS ecosystem is kind of a sweet spot for verification. It's clearly critical infrastructure, and it's demonstrably too large to get right without verification. And yet it's much smaller than a traditional, say, operating system or browser, and so it seems within reach of our tools and techniques.
That's great. So one last question, Nick. Let's suppose we do succeed in achieving this goal. How do you imagine getting the community to actually adopt this verified HTTPS ecosystem?
Right, yeah, that's a difficult question, partly because it involves, I think, a lot of intangibles. And we have a few things in mind that we think will help. So the first thing is that we're doing everything in open source, both to encourage as much scrutiny as possible, as well as to invite participation from the community. So if any of you out here are interested in this stuff, get in touch with us. The second thing that we're doing is something that Bryan mentioned earlier, is to ease deployment of our code. Although we're programming and verifying in languages like FSTAR and Daphne, we're going to compile our code and distribute it as C++, C and C++, which which should make it possible for people who are not quite familiar with our exotic verification languages to actually study our code and convince themselves that it's a suitable replacement for, say, OpenSSL. The third thing, which I think is maybe the most important and maybe also the most relevant for this faculty summit, is, I think, education. So I think it really requires a long process of education for people to appreciate the very tangible benefits that, that software verification actually provides. And what we've noticed, I think, is that in the last decade or so, students emerging from universities all around the world in computer science are coming out with a better understanding, a better appreciation for what formal methods is and what it has to offer. And it's only with this trend continuing that I think Everest will eventually succeed.
That's great to hear. I know most of you know that I am in formal methods, and I did not ask him to say that in his answer. But also, I know very well that many of you have in your undergraduate curriculum courses that teach pre and post conditions, which are just the requires and ensures clauses of Daphne, teach functional programming, which is really, in essence, what F* is all about. So the students that you are teaching today will be armed with the right kinds of approaches and techniques and skills to do this kind of verification for the future. So let me thank you for that. Thank you, Bryan. Excellent. Thank you, Nick. Great. Okay. Our last story speaks to the opening remarks I made when I talked about tomorrow's computing machines that might be made out of living matter. In particular, I'm talking about let's build computers made out of DNA molecules. And we have a biological computation group with a bunch of collaborators in Microsoft Research which aspires to be able to write in a high-level programming language, a program that you can then compile down into a machine that's made up of just DNA molecules. So this is pretty ambitious. It is pretty far out. And what I'd like to do is call Neil Dalchau to join me on stage, and we're going to talk about molecular computing. So thank you,
Hi,
Neil. Good. Before we get into the details, what I thought we should explain to the audience are what are some of the building blocks for DNA computing. And one of them I know that you and your collaborators have built is this thing called a DNA strand displacement tool. So can you explain what DNA strand displacement is? And what's the largest program you've written in this language?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jeanette. So I'm going to use an animation to help explain what DNA strand displacement is. So Watson and Crick discovered the structure of DNA some years ago now, and the complementarity rules where A binds to T and C binds to G. And what this animation is going to show is a process known as DNA strand displacement, which is being used now by a community of researchers to be able to implement computation using DNA molecules. So what you see is an input DNA strand, that single-stranded piece of DNA, which is binding to a complementary DNA molecule, which essentially plays the role of a logic gate. So the input strand binds, and it's actually displacing another piece of single-stranded DNA, which plays the role of an output molecule. So what we've generated here is an input-to-output relationship made purely from DNA. Now, by extending these DNA logic gates to be able to take multiple inputs, and then through composition, we're able to actually design arbitrary logic circuits. So with some collaborators actually here in Washington, Georg Selig's lab, we've worked very closely with them over the last years. We have implemented a DNA version of the so-called approximate majority algorithm. Now, this is an algorithm that's used in distributed computing to be able to detect the consensus of a mixed population of agents. So in our case, what we wanted to do was apply this to a mixed population of DNA agents. So on the left, you're seeing some input signals, which are pieces of DNA. Some are red and some are green. That's encoded in their DNA sequence. Now, we then can describe the approximate majority algorithm by a number of rules, which are shown in the top right-hand corner of that middle blue square.
The three rules up there, yeah.
And so they're very simple rules, but theoretical analysis of these rules enables us to conclude that the consensus is efficiently computed by this protocol. So it remains to then attempt to mimic the behavior of these rules using our DNA architecture, which relies on that DNA strand displacement process that I just showed you. And so when we measure this DNA implementation in a test tube, what we find indeed is that the consensus is efficiently computed. Well, I say efficiently, actually it takes several hours. So actually over 15 hours it took to compute the correct computation here. So I would say that this architecture is not exactly going to rival silicon anytime soon.
Well, one of my favorite other examples of a DNA computer is one that Chan and Winfrey at Caltech did that they published about in 2011, which is a machine made out of 74 DNA molecules that computes the square root of a 4-bit integer. Now, so both in that program and in this distributed consensus program, clearly scale and speed are still a limitation to this technique. But what I understand is you and your colleagues most recently are using this notion of DNA origami to address the speed and scalability limitations of the prior approaches. Can you explain what DNA origami is and what can you do with it?
Yeah, sure. So DNA origami is really fascinating. It was a technique that was pioneered by Paul Rothermund about 10 years ago in a seminal paper published in the journal Nature. And the idea is that you can actually wind a long piece of single-stranded DNA, treating it like a scaffold into a desired shape by designing shorter staple strands. So that's what you're seeing on the diagram on the left there. So the little colored ones are these staple strands. Their sequence has been designed suitably. Now, in this paper, they showed that you could actually design and realize a range of different two-dimensional shapes. So simple shapes such as rectangles, but also more complex shapes such as a star and a smiley face here. Now, these are really at the nanoscale. We're talking hundreds of nanometers here. So you have to use atomic force microscopy to be able to image them. Now, more recently, we've done something fairly exciting. So we've actually built our own experimental wet lab in MSR Cambridge. And one of the researchers in our group, called Boyan Yordanov, has actually used DNA origami as a template to fix to it small proteins, which, as you can see, have been suitably chosen to spell out MSR. So this is great advertising for MSR. And I should also acknowledge that the atomic force microscopy imaging was done with our collaborators at the University of Cambridge, Ulrich Kaiser's lab. Now, this raises the possibility of using origamis as a template for molecular circuits as well. So here we've attached proteins to the tile, but you could also, of course, attach DNA logic gates like we saw in the strand displacement circuits before. Now, by attaching them to a fixed base, you can take advantage of what we refer to as localization, which is the idea of basically removing the need for molecular diffusion for two molecules to find each other and then trigger a reaction. And so localization, in theory, should speed up our molecular circuits by orders of magnitude. And our theoretical analysis indeed has suggested that you can go from circuits running over the course of hours right down to minutes.
But then if you're building these localized molecular circuits out of these DNA origami tiles, then is there a limitation to the size of the computation that you can perform on these tiles?
Yeah, of course. The larger the tile is, the more molecules you can fix to it. So, of course, you're always going to be limited by the size of the tile. So on the one hand, you could think about maybe making bigger tiles, of course, but it also raises the possibility that maybe you can distribute computation over multiple tiles. Nevertheless, with a standard size tile, which again is about 100 nanometers big, you can already fit on 16 DNA logic gates. And in this particularly compelling example here, we've been able to implement, again in collaboration with Georg Selig's lab, a localized version of an XNOR circuit, which is implemented using dual rail logic. And what you see on the right-hand side is that experimental measurements compared with the theory, which shows that indeed these circuits can run giving the correct answer within minutes.
That's pretty impressive. And this is new work. You see it's not even published yet. So I understand that stochasticity is actually inherent to what it is you're doing, because after all, they're just DNA molecules interacting with each other, which is just chemical reactions. Yet you use probabilistic model checking in some way in your tool suite to assure that the program does the right thing. How do you actually use probabilistic model checking?
Yeah, you're quite right, Jeanette. So, stochastic fluctuations are going to become really important in localized circuits because all of those interactions are inherently at the single molecule level. So if we want to analyze, for example, how long does it take for a given circuit to complete, then we must use a probabilistic analysis to capture the effect of those molecular fluctuations. So what we use is an equation called the chemical master equation, which essentially describes the probability of a given circuit being in a particular configuration at some time t. Now we've also developed some efficient algorithms in our group in MSR that enable us to provide numerical solutions to the chemical master equation, and those are actually orders of magnitude faster than industry standard tools.
Wow, that's impressive. So let me close with just a final question of, well, this all sounds very like great science, but what are the applications that you imagine are being able to actually build or do with DNA circuits?
Yeah, so more recently, now that a lot of the technologies have been developed, people have obviously started looking at applications. And some of the cool things recently is actually using molecular programs as biosensors. So for example, you can design a DNA or an RNA sequence that will bind to its complementary sequence. So that might be used to, for example, detect a particular RNA in a cell. So you could use that for scientific research. You have your favorite RNA or maybe even protein in a cell. You can use these biosensors to detect it. Similarly, groups have developed biosensors that can detect even single nucleotide mutations in gene sequences. So that gives you a diagnostic test for a mutation that might lead to a cancer. So what I think, though, is the next possible application is to combine detection with treatment. If you can have these detectors working in a live cell and then trigger off the delivery of a treatment in a cell, then you kind of can start to imagine these smart drugs that could be used to treat a whole range of different problems that we face in the world today. Cancers, viral infections, you name it. So it's really exciting times.
That's really great. Very inspirational, I think. So thank you. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you, everyone. I hope that gives you a taste of the breadth of research and the interest that we have at Microsoft Research. We are going to close. He took the clicker, but pretend I clicked it. OK. Let me close by actually pausing to thank everyone behind the scenes who have come together to make this event possible. So that is, of course, the MSR outreach team, but it's also the IT support team, the administrative assistants who are all working behind the scenes to make this event. They have been working for months, planning for this event, and weeks and days and nights, actually setting things up. I also want to thank Victor Ball and Harold Javid for organizing this event and the agenda. So thank you, everyone.